So when the pressure's on, you remember the people who helped you get this far, whose knowledge guided you and whose care kept you grounded. For me, it was my dad, my mentor, who believed in me when I was just getting started in journalism. A real-life example that showed me when you work with someone who knows a lot and cares even more, you're unstoppable. At Truist, that's exactly how they approach banking. Truist, leaders in banking, unwavering in care. See what knowledge and care can do for you at truist.com/unstoppable. Truist, member FDIC, leading based on top 10 commercial bank.
Lowe's knows Sundays are for football, so tackle your home improvement projects by Saturday and earn your Sunday with great deals on LG and Bosch appliances, select Bounty and Swiffer cleaning products, and more. Then once your to-do list is done, get ready to kick back, relax, and enjoy the game. Shop in-store or online now and earn your Sunday with help from Lowe's, official partner of the NFL.
This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason. In this episode 1053 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, thanks for tuning in. I'd been running really hot with this sleeper show heading into last week. I'm talking like 4 straight awesome weeks. And I knew that last week was going to be tough. And so there were a few more misses than I've had over the last month, but I'm still pretty happy overall with how things went. On the bad side, Sam Darnold was a horrible pick. Romeo Doubs was too. Kyle Pitts couldn't get going. And then a lot of the deep sleepers, they didn't do that much at all either. I'm talking Jalen Lane, Xavier Legette, Jerry McNichols, and AJ Barner. But Jackson Dart was great. Aaron Jones came through with almost 16 PPR points. Troy Franklin had 15. Wan'Dale Robinson and Darius Slayton were both over 12. Alec Pierce had a big game. Parker Washington was solid. And the mid-tier tight ends, my goodness, every single one of them scored at least 9.5 PPR points. But 4 of the 5 hit 14.5 PPR points. Those 4 being Theo Johnson, Jawan Johnson, K. Dotton, and Dalton Schultz. Marcus Mariota and Jacoby Brissett, they were good deep quarterback plays too. And Kyle Williams, he saved his day with that big touchdown. So no, it wasn't as good as some of the other recent weeks, but with what I was working with, I'm happy with those results. And by the way, I went to Twitter and I asked if people wanted to keep hearing about these hits and misses to open up the sleeper show. And 80% of you said to keep the recap. So I'm keeping the recap. The people have spoken. Now let's move on to week 11. We'll start as usual by looking at players rostered in 50 to 80% of Yahoo leagues. And at quarterback, I have 2 for you in this tier. One of them is Joe Flacco. Flacco's been the QB1 in fantasy football since he was traded to Cincinnati. He's averaging about 25 standard fantasy points per game. That alone is tough to bench, but he's also facing Pittsburgh, a team he destroyed back in week 7. I'd expect the Steelers defense to have better answers in this game, and it's in Pittsburgh too. But they're a top 10 matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted fantasy points allowed. So Flacco can find your lineup. Now, if you want a high variance option, JJ McCarthy, on paper, he's in a good spot. The Vikings get the Bears this week. They have a team total over 25 points, and they're at home. And Chicago is the 4th best matchup this season by adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks. They've allowed about 27 passing yards over expected per game this year. I know McCarthy hasn't gotten it done, but it could be a get-right game for him. At running back, I've got one player in this tier for you, and it's Woody Marks. I think people should be excited about what Marks did last week on the usage front. But 1 week, that's not a trend yet. And this week will be a good test for that. The Texans are 7-point favorites against a Titans team that's allowed the 4th most adjusted fantasy points to running backs this year. We saw Marks give us an RB6 performance against Tennessee the last time these two teams met, but I do think there's at least some risk that we see more Nick Chubb this weekend than we did last week. But more optimistically, if Marks gets the same workload week over week, he could smash. We're talking about a 74% running back rush share, a 55% route share, and one of the best matchups in the league for running backs. So he's a good option. At wide receiver in this group, I'm going to cheat just a little bit and go to Quentin Johnston, just because he's slightly above that 80% mark. QJ's been kind of disappointing after what he did during the first 4 weeks of the season, but he's coming off a game against Pittsburgh where he hit a 30% target share. It was only a 5-catch, 42-yard performance, but the matchup this week, it's pretty juicy. The Chargers get the Jags. Jacksonville's completely average when it comes to adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, but they've been specifically bad against perimeter wideouts. Against the slot, they've given up actually the fewest wide receiver points per game this year. Against outside wideouts, they're third worst. And Johnston, he's run the vast majority of his routes from the outside. The other guys in LA are fine too. But I think Quentin Johnston has a better game this week than what we've seen over the last month or so. Jameis Winston is starting for the Giants. I think this at least keeps the wide receivers neutral. But it could help Darius Slayton a little bit more than Wan'Dale Robinson, because Winston has this tendency to throw the ball down the field. He's aggressive. And the matchup, it's better for Slayton this week too. They get Green Bay, and the Packers have been below average at stopping perimeter wide receivers, while above average at stopping slot guys. So that's a bump for Slayton and a slight downgrade for Wan'Dale Robinson. I think they're closer this week than many would expect. Just do be aware that Slayton didn't practice on Wednesday. If he can't go this week, Wan'Dale Robinson's going to play more on the outside, and he could just get peppered with targets. Now, last in this tier at tight end is Zach Ertz. I know they don't have Jaden Daniels, but the Commanders get the Dolphins this week. Miami's the fourth best matchup for tight ends by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Ertz is also averaging a strong 22% target share per game rate over his last 5. It could come together for a nice outing for Zach Ertz. This next group of sleepers consists of guys rostered in 20 to 50% of Yahoo leagues. And again, we'll start at quarterback. And there's a lot of streamers in this group. Aaron Rodgers is the first one to call out. The Steelers have an implied team total against Cincinnati of 27.5 points. And the Bengals are the second best matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. They're also terrible at defending tight ends. And Pittsburgh, they target their tight ends a lot. They have the second highest tight end target share in all of football. We saw that it worked the last time these two teams played. So it could be a bounce back game for Aaron Rodgers and this Steelers offense. Jacoby Brissett's another one to call out here. He's now finished as a QB1, a top 12 quarterback in each of his 4 starts this year. Now the Cardinals get a slightly above average opponent when they face San Francisco. The pace score in this game is pretty good, so there could be more plays run, and Arizona has a 23-point implied team total. Even without Marvin Harrison Jr., Brissett should be solid enough. I still have 3 more quarterback streamers, for real, and one of them, Tua Tagovailoa. Tua faces off against a Commanders defense that has been struggling. The Dolphins have a 25-point implied team total, and Washington's the 5th best matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. Quarterbacks have averaged 30 more passing yards per game when they face the Commanders versus other opponents, versus their season-long average. That makes Tua a worthy streamer. Now look, I know that Geno Smith is very hard to trust, but he does get Dallas this week. That's the best matchup on paper in the entire league. The Cowboys got some help on defense at the deadline. They're also coming off their bye, so there is some risk with this matchup. But they've also given up 58 passing yards per game this year over expected. If there's one time to start Geno Smith, it'd be this week. And then the last one's Marcus Mariota. As I mentioned, the Commanders get the Dolphins, and Miami's a top 10 matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. Mariota's giving fantasy managers at least a couple of points per game with his legs. And Washington is one of the better pressure rate matchups in the league this week. It's at least above average, so Mariota's in play. The Cardinals' backfield is really up in the air right now. Bam Knight suffered an ankle injury last week. I have no idea if he's going to play. Is Trey Benson going to be back this week? It doesn't sound likely. But I currently have no idea. Let's just pretend that both of those guys are out. That would leave the backfield to Michael Carter and Amari DiMercado. And it's a matchup against San Francisco, a team that's allowed the 9th most adjusted fantasy points to running backs this year. Now, we've seen this backfield tandem in the past, and Michael Carter got the edge, but DiMercado's actually been running pretty well. So I'd probably just prefer him if it came down to these two running backs. If Knight is in, we should probably lean that way. And then Carter is more of a deep play. I've got Tyjae Spears in here too. It's not the best matchup on paper for Tennessee. Houston ranks as a bottom 10 matchup for running backs this season, but the Titans are big underdogs, as they typically are. And the Texans, they're 10th this season in adjusted target share allowed to running backs. As we know, Spears has taken on that pass catching role in that backfield. He's seen a solid 12% target share over his last 4 games. So if you're in a pinch, he could give you some points in PPR leagues. It's tough to not go with Parker Washington right now, regardless of what's happening around him at the other wide receiver positions in Jacksonville. He's seen target shares of 21%, 27%, and 29% over his last 3 games. Washington's also playing more in the slot. He's actually played 3 games this year with a slot rate of 50% or greater. In those games, he's had target shares of 29%, 27%, and 29%. That's pretty awesome. Now, the Chargers are not a great matchup in general, but they've been a little bit worse against the slot versus outside receivers. I will say, though, Washington did not practice on Wednesday. Keep an eye on that. And Brian Thomas did. And obviously, they have Jacoby Myers now. So he's a very risky play, but the stability of that slot role, it's at least been there. The Cowboys are the worst team against outside wide receivers in all of football. They also allow the most adjusted fantasy points to wideouts. They get Vegas this week, so that brings me to two guys. One player's in this tier, one's a deep sleeper. But Trey Tucker has not ranked in the top 20 since week 3. That's actually the only time he's been higher than wide receiver 24 in a given week. That's when he went off for 41 PPR points. At least we know there's a ceiling with him. He just hasn't been that productive, though. However, he's almost entirely an outside receiver for Vegas, and he's run a route on 100% of the team's dropbacks over the last 2 weeks. So given that matchup, he makes sense as a sleeper. And then the deeper play is Tyler Lockett. I'll just shout him out now. Lockett ran a route on 80% of the Raiders' dropbacks last week. He saw a 24% target share. He did have a 64% slot rate, though, so I do prefer Trey Tucker to Tyler Lockett. Not just because he's going to be on the field more, but I like the matchup more in general. Another wideout to consider is Tez Johnson. He's been getting it done on the production front, but he is a regression candidate. He's played about 4 to 5 PPR points per game above expected over the last month. The Bucs get the Bills this week, though. It's a game that could see some scoring. And Buffalo's a top half matchup for wide receivers this year by adjusted points allowed. I don't love Johnson because he's coming off a game where he had just an 11% target share, but you could do worse. Romeo Doubs hurt his chest against the Eagles in that awful Monday night game, at least awful from a fantasy perspective. If he can't go, which it does sound like he's probably going to be able to go, but if he can't, you could look at Christian Watson. Even if Romeo Doubs does play, I think Watson's a decent play this week. They get a Giants team that's allowed the 10th most adjusted fantasy points to wide receivers this year. Watson's seen his route share gradually rise since he came back from that ACL. It's been 65%, 75%, and then 83% over his 3 games this year. It's a really good spot for him. At tight end, I'm rocking with my guy Theo Johnson, even with Jameis Winston expected to start against Green Bay. The Packers are a pretty average opponent for tight ends by adjusted points allowed, and Johnson has about a 20% target share this season since Malik Nabers went down. He's been at about an 87% route share over his last 4. He should be involved, and maybe we see some more down the field looks with Jameis Winston under center. And then I'm going to go back to Colston Loveland this week too. His route share did drop with Cole Kmet back last week, but the Bears get Minnesota in week 11. The Vikings have been an above average matchup for tight ends this season by adjusted points allowed, and they rank second in adjusted target share allowed to the position. Loveland's peripherals weren't really that great last week, I'm not going to lie, but he's been so effective lately when he's been targeted. You have to imagine the Bears get him more involved this week than that 11% target share that he had last week. This final tier of players includes guys rostered in 0 to 20% of Yahoo leagues. I've got one quarterback for you. It's a guy that I've already talked about, but it's Jameis Winston. This is not an amazing spot for Winston. Let's just be honest. They get the Packers. Green Bay's a below average matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted fantasy points allowed. This game is in New York though, and the Giants likely can't go with a very conservative approach. And Winston's hit 23 standard fantasy points in 3 of his last 7 starts. That came last year with Cleveland. There are a ton of good streaming options this week to choose from, so you probably don't have to go this low. But I wouldn't be surprised if he's moderately usable. We've got some interesting running backs in this group this week. The first one's Sean Tucker. I shouted him out on the 15 Transaction Show earlier in the week because he's seen more work in that Bucs backfield over the last couple of games. He's had running back rush shares of 41% and 47%. Now, he won't get it done for you through the air, but the Bucs get the Bills this week. Buffalo's allowed 22 running back rushing yards over expected per game this year. That's one of the worst rates in the league. They're also a top 5 opponent for running backs by adjusted fantasy points allowed. So in deeper formats, Tucker might be okay. We're obviously looking more at backups in this tier, and one backup who is interesting this week is Emmanuel Wilson. He's been seeing route shares of like 30% or so consistently over the last month and a half. He didn't get a ton of run last week in what was a closer game for Green Bay, but this one against the Giants could go in the opposite direction, hypothetically. And New York is the second best matchup for running backs by adjusted points allowed. Chris Rodriguez is the easiest go-to in this tier at running back. He was playing as Washington's RB1 last week before suffering a shoulder injury, but it sounds like he's going to be good to go this week. If he's seeing a lot of that early down stuff for Washington, that's big because they get a Miami team that's been below average against running backs this year in terms of fantasy points allowed and the number of rushing yards they've allowed versus expectation. So Chris Rodriguez, pretty strong sleeper. It doesn't sound like J.K. Dobbins is going to be on the field this week and probably longer, which means it's R.J. Harvey season. But we know the Broncos will likely still split that backfield to some degree. To me, Tyler Bidet would only see a small uptick. Jaleel McLaughlin would step in and get more on the ground. Now, my initial reaction was to say that McLaughlin would be my pick for this week as the sleeper, outside of R.J. Harvey, of course. But the more I've dug into it, the more I think you might be better off, at least in PPR leagues, to use Tyler Bidet. The Broncos get the Chiefs, and Kansas City is a bottom 5 team for running backs by adjusted points allowed. But if the Broncos hit a negative game script, which is very, very possible, they could use more Tyler Bidet. And not only that, but Kansas City ranks 4th in adjusted target share allowed to running backs. That also favors Bidet. So I'm going to lean Bidet as a PPR option, maybe McLaughlin more in a standard one. But I expect both to at least touch the ball. I'm pretty bullish about R.J. Harvey, but it won't only be R.J. Harvey in that backfield. The Texans are an extremely tilting team. The way they've deployed their rookie wide receivers this year, very, very frustrating. Jaden Higgins has hit a 50% route share just once with an active Nico Collins, and it came last week. He's now hit target shares, though, despite that, of 21% and 16% in 2 of his last 3. Now, I could say that Xavier Hutchinson is a sleeper here, but I'm going to go with rational coaching, and I'm going to go with upside and say Higgins. The Texans face the Titans this week, and Tennessee has been worse against outside receivers than slot ones. So if you're desperate, maybe Higgins finds the end zone once again. The Dolphins get the Commanders this week, as I've talked about, and Malik Washington gets a great slot matchup. He's lined up out of the slot on about half of his routes over the last handful of weeks, and he's seen about a 17% target share per game rate since Tyreek Hill went down. I like him this week because they can take advantage of when he's in the slot. The Commanders give up the second most fantasy points per game to slot wide receivers. That's according to PFF data. So I don't mind Malik Washington in a deep, deep league. Now, I know you guys are going to think that I'm lying, but I was so close to calling out Jalen Nailor last week on this show because Baltimore has not been good against the slot. And then he goes out, he has a monster game. And man, that was so frustrating because it would have been an awesome, awesome call. I want to be as good as I possibly can. What can I say? But I'm going back to him this week. The Vikings get the Bears, and Chicago's actually been about average when it comes to fantasy points allowed to perimeter receivers. But slot guys, they're 3rd in adjusted points allowed to the position, and they're 9th in adjusted slot target share allowed. Naylor's seen target shares of 17% and 15% over his last 2. I wouldn't be insanely surprised if he has an okay outing again this week. Mac Hollins should be on your radar this week with Kayshon Boutte sidelined. Hollins has hit a 30% target share. This is real. He's hit a 30% target share in 2 of his last 3. And they get a favorable matchup against the Jets secondary this week that no longer has Sauce Gardner. So Hollins is definitely in play. So are the Cardinals wide receivers. Marvin Harrison Jr., he's out this week because of appendicitis. That's going to allow Michael Wilson to probably get more looks, to definitely get more looks. But I really like Greg Dortch this week too. They get the 49ers, and San Francisco, according to my numbers, they're the absolute worst team against slot receivers. I'm talking most adjusted fantasy points allowed and the highest adjusted target share allowed to slot guys. Dortch is definitely not as safe as Michael Wilson. Wilson's the safer play. But I could see Dortch coming through with a big day too. So both of them are deeper sleepers. At tight end in this tier, I'm going to go with a 15 transactions guy, Dawson Knox. Like I said earlier this week, when Dalton Kincaid was sidelined earlier this season, Knox saw a very respectable 77% route share. He just faced Atlanta, so the target share wasn't very high. Atlanta does that to tight ends. Despite that, he did find the end zone. Now Buffalo gets an average to slightly below average matchup against Tampa Bay. But it's better than that Atlanta one. So I think Knox can be okay as a streamer. Last week without Jacoby Myers, the Raiders changed things up a bit and ran 12 personnel on 47% of their plays. Prior to that, their 12 personnel rate was 27%. That meant a little bit more Michael Mayer. Mayer had a 16% target share, and now the Raiders get the Cowboys in what could be a pass-heavy, higher-scoring game for them. So as a deep sleeper, Michael Mayer kind of works. There's also Luke Musgrave. He didn't come through in week 10, though he was close to having an okay day. But he did run a route on 81% of Jordan Love's dropbacks. Now he gets the Giants. New York's just an average matchup against tight ends. Green Bay, though, has an implied team total of 26 points. It's one of the better marks on the slate. That should give us more confidence in Musgrave's floor this week. And then finally, I'm going to go with Jonnu Smith, but maybe even Pat Freiermuth. The last time the Steelers faced the Bengals, they really got their tight ends involved. That's because Cincinnati is by far, the worst team in football at defending tight ends. They rank first in adjusted target share allowed to the position, and they're first in adjusted points allowed. Team tight ends, when facing Cincinnati, they score 9.5 more PPR points per game than their season-long average. That's by far the biggest margin in the league. Smith is my pick just because he's been running more routes than the other tight ends this season, but Pat Freiermuth, he could be a decent deep sleeper as well. Now, as for the defenses this week, we'll go with Atlanta against Carolina, like I said earlier in the week, Chicago against Minnesota, given the way the Vikings offense has been playing, and actually, every defense against J.J. McCarthy has been a top 12 defense this year in his 4 starts. And then I don't really mind Kansas City against Denver. Though that's more of a Denver is just a 20-point implied team total type of play, as opposed to one where I think Kansas City gets a lot of sacks in the game. Honestly, though, it's a pretty tough week for defensive streaming. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you had subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly mailbag show.
Nationwide is so much more than a great insurance company. They're one of America's largest financial services companies. Like how I'm more than Saquon Barkley, the NFL's reigning leading rusher. I'm also the NFL's leading husher. Shh, hush up back there. Wow, I might have just set the hushing record. Well, almost. For your insurance and financial needs, Nationwide is on your side.
Nationwide Investment Services Corporation, member FINRA, Columbus, Ohio.
Whether you're kicking off a campaign, gearing up for an event, or suiting up your team, 4imprint has the promo products to move your brand down the field. With thousands of customizable options like premium apparel, drinkware, tech totes, and giveaways, it's easy to score fan favorites that deliver impact. You'll get expert support, speedy delivery, and their 360-degree guarantee, so you can be 4imprint certain your order arrives exactly right on time. Explore more at 4imprint.com.
4imprint, for certain.